Here we are at Old Nat's house, 1717. You know, one of the older houses. This is part of the early settlement of the old Easton's Point farm belonging to John Easton that was divided up and largely sold to Quakers. This is a two-bedroom, one-bath house now. And at the time, I'm sure the people who were living in it felt they had a palace because it was warm, dry, it was close to their work. Warm in the winter and relatively cool in the summer. It was close to the water, which is where the fish and the trade was to be had. And so it's lovely that this house continues to exist as a example of the very, very early settlement of the community in a totally simple colonial central masonry style house. That central masonry chimney coming up through, you see the milled edge front of the clapboard, which is showing that even in a humble house like this, they really wanted to go that extra distance to have the character so that that wood wouldn't split over time. This is just a few years later, 1725. But you already see that the house is quite a bit grander. It still has that same mill edge. You see the corner boards, which is a great way to deal with the clapboards. This house has been, like many, raised in the last 10 years. There used to be a stoop up into the house here and similarly there, but to try and get it up out of the flood zone, it was raised up, and these side stairs, which are not original, were added. All right, we're going to now head to the Pitt's Head Tavern. And we talk about this. Everybody in the Point is very proud of when their house was built, and they want a plaque stating who built it and when they did. These guys went even further. They put the whole history on a plaque. It's temporary, but this building was built in the High Georgian style. You see alternating dormers, both arched and gabled. So this is really the high colonial style. This is about as fancy a building as you could have. This, as you can see, has been raised up also to deal with the flood hazard. It's not the first time it's been moved. It used to be in, as we were saying, Washington Square, and relocated here as that area became more commercial, and this area was staying more residential. And then it went through a series of hands, became a multifamily, and now is being renovated and turned into a single family luxury residence. Just a few years before the Pitt's Head Tavern House, more of the middle style of Georgian. You see it doesn't have any of the dormers on the roof, but it does have the baluster up top, which is purely decorative. This is a gambrel style house, and so it's utilizing the space very effectively. So it's a nice blend between elegance and practicality. It's trying to achieve both. Apparently, when this house was in dire condition, the door surround and pineapple got moved to another house, and then when this one was being restored after the Preservation Society acquired it in 1945 for the purpose of renovation, they asked to get their original surround and pineapple back, but as part of the deal they created a new one for the other building. But these people very kindly preserved it on the grounds of St. John's so that it could return back here in due time. We're going to just turn around, and this, as we said, has two front doors, one to the street and one to the water. You know, this is maybe 60 years before the Revolution, and this is about 80 years after the Revolution. This is a what they call Queen Anne style. It's got a very ornate, articulated character. It has multiple different coloration. It's got its own little carriage house. So already you can see the development of this area rather precipitously. This is almost like an in-house, in-town estate compared to the others. But you'll see the corbelling, you see the coins, that's Quoins, which are the things replicating the stone masonry, the pendentives, lots and lots of coloration and decoration. That's why these are called painted ladies. Often you'll have a corner tower of some sort. That's, again, a very typical feature of the Queen Anne style. Let's head down further. Here we have the Gothic Revival style of St. John's Episcopal Church. Force that seesaws through architecture, pulling architecture forward, and then people saying, that's too much change, let's go back. And then other people saying, that's too old-fashioned, let's go forward again. So the Gothic Revival was one of those periods when society as a whole said, why can't we go back to that wonderful Gothic period where there was a great, of course, romantic feeling about what we now call the Dark Ages, but the Gothic architecture that was left from that area was really lovely and spectacular. But while this was sort of the high-style Gothic revival, practiced by people like Richard Upjohn at Trinity Church in New York and elsewhere, the Carpenter Gothic or American Gothic, this style was being copied in Ohio and Indiana and other places, but not out of, carefully carved ashlar stone, but more out of board and batten, sharply angled windows instead of these peaked arch windows with tracery. This is a kind of a simplified version. So the parish house is built in a much simpler style. Instead of the heavy beams that you'll see here, there it's just wood trusses attached out of straight elements. But the effect is very similar, but at a budget level. So we have, in a way, both styles of Gothic revival here, both the high style and the Gothic, the Carpenter Gothic. We are at the Sanford Coville House, owned by one family for about 3 generations, and they recently sold it. But this is, like the J&A Griswold House, a very wonderful example of the stick style architecture. You'll notice the structural elements which are merely decorative that have been applied to the outside of the clapboard, unlike in Europe where the Tudor style, the structure would have been built of wood and then everything would have been infilled with wattle and stucco or masonry, because that was much more available than wood, because most of the wood had been cut down in Europe over time. The reflection of the École de Beaux-Arts style that Richard Morris Hunt brought back with him from Europe, where everything was very painterly. Even if you look at the roof, you'll see that it's made out of a very ornate pattern of cut slate shingles. And in the J&A Griswold House, those are different colors so that patterns are created. So the entire building becomes really a canvas. And on the inside, very much again like the J&A Griswold House, if you go in, you suddenly have a 3-story atrium inside that you're not expecting. And you suddenly have a sense of a house as not just being a stacked layer cake of floors, but as something that has a 3-dimensional character both on the outside and the inside. Wonderful example of stick style architecture right here on the point. Places like Boston and Philadelphia, they created the federal style architecture, which was basically brick buildings where crowns were being removed and eagles were being put in their place. We didn't have a lot of architecture built during that time, but immediately after that came the Greek revival style. People were traveling around Greece and Rome and Syria and seeing these examples of ancient architecture. They were being recreated. The work of Vitruvius had been translated, and suddenly there was a lot of interest in the architecture of this ancient these ancient democratic republics that we were trying to emulate in the United States. And so naturally, our architecture tended towards that as well. You'll see in earlier versions, the gable faces the side often, with the front being a sloped surface on which, like the Pitt's Head Tavern or the Hunter House, faces the street. Here, just by turning the building 90 degrees, they were able to get the gable to face the street. These are Doric columns, very simple, but clearly of Greek origin. You'll see, even though the gable doesn't come all the way across on this house, the eaves turn to sort of imply that classic relationship. And here you see that there's trim that goes all the way across, creating that triangular pediment. And you have, again, the columns and the entry. So this is an example of people trying to kind of bring their house into the fashionable style, mainly just by turning its angle and doing a couple of decorative details to imply their allegiance to the democracy that they were now part of. Clapboards, coming down to a smaller clapboard, but then a lot of additional detail, things like stained glass windows, carved surrounds, other elements were added to kind of, jazz up the old house and make it more appropriate to a merchant living in the mid-19th century. Probably 1780s in its initial, and then probably it got a really major makeover in the 1850s and 1860s. And you'll notice around the side, we'll actually come around the side. When they wanted to add yet another addition to the back of the house, instead of building it, they found another house that was about to be torn down, and they relocated it and just added it on, and that became an extra bedroom up top and an extra sitting room down at the lower level. And so the oldest part of the house is the addition, and the newest part of the house is the main house. Anyway, we're going to keep going. And here you see the very kind of simple, pragmatic architecture that's probably been combined over time to make this house possible. But there's wonderful little examples of very, very old colonial architecture mixed in with everything else here. So we're going to now go on the Second Empire style just beyond. Okay, here we have some more examples of European architecture that's being brought back to the United States. This is Second Empire. This is Villa Marina, which was a house that became a convent, that became a bed and breakfast, that is now being returned back to a single-family house. As you see, the mansard roof, the slate tiles, the central porch, the corbels under the eaves, those are all very standard features. If you look at Richard Morris Hunt's renovation of Chateau-sur-Mer, which took a sort of an anonymous style builder house and really gave it more European high style with a new Adam-esque, and by Adam-esque I'm talking about Adams Family-esque tower. Yet it has the carved ashlar stone, which clearly indicates it's a kind of a grander house than other houses of this period. But it's still very strongly a reflection of the type of architecture that was being brought to America by people like Richard Morris Hunt and Charles Follen McKim, and then recreated here for people who are hungry for that level of sophistication and erudition that a house like this indicated. Here we have the John Bigelow carriage house of 1876. This is by Charles Follen McKim. He was experimenting with taking the Queen Anne style that we've seen elsewhere. It's got the tower element. It's got the chamfered porches, the bracketed elements, but it's now getting rid of all of that polychromy, getting rid of all those pendentives. I argue frequently that because of its true novelty, the Newport Casino is the first major shingle style project. You'd have to look at this and say, this has all of the same characteristics of that style. You know, it's so close to shingle style. Maybe this is where it began. And maybe at the casino, it was really the flowering. But as we walk around, you're going to see a lot of shingle style buildings that were built not 100 years ago, but 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's a style that had tremendous popularity because it both had elegance on one side, you know, the wood and the craftsmanship, but it also had informality. It was asymmetric. You could add on to it. It became synonymous with places like Newport, was therefore adopted by other resort communities elsewhere, and has kind of become the universal typology of the comfortable weekend residence. One thing that Newport had an awful lot of in the late 19th and particularly the early 20th century was convents. Why was that? Well, you had a lot of these large ornate buildings. When the tax rate on $1 million went from 3% to 83%, a lot of people decided those big houses really weren't quite what they wanted to deal with. And the question was, how could they be reused? So this building here, the Richard Upjohn Queen Anne style house that we're going to walk past soon, was given to a convent, and then additional buildings were added on to make it fully functional. And this is the chapel, which is sort of a downscale version of the St. John's Chapel that we've seen. Instead of stone, it's brick and stucco. But anyway, the spirit is there. So you have a combination of Italianate, colonial, Gothic revival, all brought together. So they weren't too worried about staying stylistically pure. They were really being pulled and pushed by the philosophy and the typological needs of any given period and making it work. And that's what we're still doing to a certain degree. This has now become affordable housing. It serves as a community and is beloved by the people who live in it. And so it has its own chapel. A very nice one at that. Newport saw a major change, which was the completion of the Pell Bridge. And there was a lot of argument as to where it should land or not land. City fathers of Newport and the merchants felt that all the traffic should come right down into the throat of Newport. And so they built America's Cup Boulevard as a result. A way to capture the traffic and bring it in, except for the people who lived here, I think that would have been more successful. And here we are 50 years later, trying to slowly unwind the things that were done in a relatively short period of time in that period of suburbanization where the car was really king. We're seeing the Italianate style with the very simple brackets and the cubicle type mass for the building. And we're going to head on down this way. So of all the styles of architecture that Newport has flirted with over the years, the one that it helped invent and the one that's probably spread the widest is the shingle style. And these are new buildings that were built in the last 10, 15 years. And yet, because of the flexibility of the style, the fact that you don't need stone, you don't need to have big marble columns, you don't need to have a lot of the features of the buildings that we associate with the Gilded Age. But now that style, through architectural publications, influenced architects like Frank Lloyd Wright and spread throughout the country and became a really popular style everywhere and continues to proliferate. So you see here the new garage, very much in that same style. Here, the articulation, the green and the natural shingles is similar to what you see at the Newport Casino, but it's really the second wave of this same architecture that came out of that very ornate Queen Anne style, but now has kind of become a more understated, elegant style that's still proliferating throughout Newport and throughout the country. Well, this is the reality. There weren't a lot of empty lots in the 1950s, but where they were some, people wanted to infill and they wanted an American house, simple ranch-style house with some vague colonial elements, although now we have the actual colonial to compare it to. It doesn't shine quite as brightly. With the one-car garage right next to it, the driveway up to it, the garage is as prominent as the house, in some cases more prominent, and one of them found its way here to Newport, Rhode Island. In a way, it's good to see the full spectrum of architecture from the early 18th century to the present day. So we are kind of quickly passing by 1950 and 60 on our way back to our starting point. Another one by Charles Follen McKim, which has, again, some more of the features, the very ornate columns and brackets, but yet it's starting to lose a lot of the other polychromy, and it's starting to adopt the multiple styles of cut shingle as opposed to different colors. It was different patterns of shingle based on how they were cut. So this is, again, another very important pre-shingle style house that's just about to cross that line into a new style. You know, I was looking for one of the NRF houses, and there's 80 of them here in the Point and elsewhere, and that NRF program was really a follow-on to what was called Operation Clabbered. But we'll see plaques that have a O and a C and an acorn. That's Operation Clabbered, and then the other ones will be NRF. You see wonderful details like the sitting rail, which is about 7 inches wide, right at the right height to sit down, so that you can entertain your 20 friends out here without bringing 20 chairs out. Early on, there were the Gilded Age houses along Bellevue, and then there were the colonial houses here. Catherine Warren took on the Bellevue Avenue houses with the help of her friend Gladys Zipari, and their third friend, Doris Duke, said, okay, if you've got those, I'll take care of the colonial houses. And so she started buying up these houses and fixing them, and so they were the nice ones, but very quickly, because there were now enough nice ones, people who were uncertain of the neighborhood decided, okay, well, if Doris Duke's buying houses there, it's probably a good thing. And they started to buy houses and fix them up. And as you can see now, there are very, very few unrenovated houses. Everything's looking pretty spiffy down here in the Point. This building here, the Gateway Center, was built as a multimodal transportation hub. The big project the year it was built was the Jeddah Airport, which had naturally tents because of the need for it to have very, very large groups of people arriving and leaving by plane, but not being able to afford to build it all inside. They thought at the time, oh, well, if it's good enough for Jeddah, why don't we just do it here too? When those got torn down, we helped work out something that looked more like train station, because that's what had once been here long ago. So we're trying to take this very modern development and begin to knit it back into the larger community. And that's what is happening throughout the Point neighborhood. As people build and renovate houses, they're trying to do it to meet the new building code, which requires the buildings to be much higher, but trying their best to integrate it back into the style and character of the other houses so that it really hangs together as the 300-year-old neighborhood that it is. So anyway, thank you for coming on this tour.